Welcome back to Media Apocalypse, our series about the threats facing journalism, news gathering, and the flow of information on matters of public concern in our democracy, and dedicated to exploring solutions, both in law and elsewhere, for preserving the press function. Our guest today is Margaret Sullivan, since 2016, the media columnist for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post, she was the public editor for the New York Times. Prior to the Times, she was the top editor of the Buffalo News, where she was, in fact, its first female editor. She's been a member of the Pulitzer Prize Board and a director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where she led the First Amendment Committee. Her book, Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy, was published last year by Columbia Global Reports. Margaret, thank you for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me.
I want to start with a question or two to get at key issues that have motivated our Media Apocalypse videocast series. You've written a good deal about journalism in America, and the theme of your recent book is about the crisis local journalism is facing today, just staying alive in American communities. You've written about the value of local journalism to the basics of democracy in America, and how the loss of local newspapers in particular is, among other things, a loss of the public square that newspapers create and the sense of community. How would you, however, itemize the specific functions that the press engages in that are critical to sustaining democratic governance, and that regardless of the medium today or tomorrow, we should be striving to protect?
Well, thank you, Sandy. And you know, I'm very deeply enmeshed in all these issues, not only because I have lived a whole career in local journalism, but because I write about that now at the Washington Post and wrote about journalism at the New York Times. So I come at it from various directions. But I think the most important role that local journalism and all journalism plays is giving citizens a foundation of truth and facts so that they can function as citizens in our democratic republic. So when local newspapers fade away, which they have so dramatically, a well-trusted form of news disappears or is weakened. And when that happens, well, I think we're already seeing what happens. We no longer have a common set of facts that citizens can work off of as they, elect public officials, as they hold people accountable, as they live their lives, as they talk to their neighbors. Instead, we are finding things out. I mean, citizens in general are finding things out through social media, sometimes in a pretty filtered bubble, and our politics and our colloquy has become so much more tribalized.
I want to, if you don't mind, get a little more granular. One of the issues we have and will continue to address is how one defines the press. How one defines those individuals or those entities that we should be trying to protect through law, through economic stimulus, often done in a functional way. How would you define the press?
Well, we often hear people talk about the media, and in some ways that's a bad word. We don't like the media, they're evil. And I think when people hear, it's interesting that you're using the term the press, which in a way is a little, I mean this in a good way, it's a little old fashioned, because it sort of suggests, I don't mean that you're old fashioned, but the term is old fashioned. We tend to talk about the news media now. But when we talk about the news media, we mean something very broad. We could mean Breitbart, we could mean Fox News, we could mean the New York Times, or NBC News or a million other things. Even the entertainment media sort of, gets all wrapped up in this. I think when we talk about the press, which is I like to use the term when I'm talking about the press that we need to preserve. I like to use the term, and I think I coined it, the reality-based press. So not the craziness that's being spewed on Newsmax or on Alex Jones's InfoWars, but actual factual reporting that is verified, that when, for example, when they get something wrong, they correct it. They tell you who their sources are whenever possible. All of these kinds of qualities. Do they have a standards and ethics policy? There are many characteristics of the reality-based press that are not universal in the media.
I am, by the way, I confess to being old-fashioned, but I also have a goal out of all of this, which is I draw the word the press out of the First Amendment of the Constitution. And so therefore, when we talk about protecting the press, I probably do have a very old-fashioned view in mind, but thank you.
I mean, believe me, it's not intended as a knock. I think it's the traditional, again, factually based way of communicating reporting that can be called the press. And you're right, it's enshrined in the First Amendment. Thank goodness it is. It's helped quite a bit, although not enough, apparently.
I think that's fair. RonNell, I think you're going to pick up from where we just left off.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, Margaret, for being here. I really, really found your book helpful, and I'm glad that we have the chance to talk about it. In particular, I think that your book does such a useful job of surveying the practical losses that communities experience with the death of local news, accountability and watchdoggery, but also the shaping of shared community conversations and sort of using expertise to engage in the kind of crucial gatekeeping and prioritizing of how those conversations should happen. As Sandy said, sort of the major goal of our wider project here is to identify some of those core constitutional press functions so that we can shape conversations about how to preserve those functions. And so I thought I'd ask you to help us think about this, sort of drawing upon all that practical information that you gathered in the source of researching this book, and think about it from this really particular angle. What sorts of things do people turn to if they don't have local press? Is it social media or talk radio or gossip or something else? And then maybe you can sort of lay that foundation for us, and then give us the explanations of why specifically those substitutions are suboptimal, and how that helps us think about what the core press functions are that need to be preserved and that we should be strategically thinking about how to save.
So there's no one answer to where do people go when, let's sort of narrow it. Let's say you live in a community that used to have 2 vibrant newspapers, as well as a few TV stations that covered news and perhaps a public radio station. And let's just say that now we're down to 1 newspaper, but it's a quarter of the newsroom that it used to have, which is probably fairly typical. And the rest of those media sources, let's say we're in Cleveland, just to pick a place. Let's say the rest of those media sources used to really feed off the newspapers reporting a lot. They would repurpose it. They would do their own reporting from it. Now that source is gone. Where do people go? And I'm not picking on Cleveland, because like Buffalo, my hometown, it's a Lake Erie city, and I like it. Where do those people go for news? Well, I think that Facebook is a place they go. And I think we all know a lot of the harm that's come from the use and overuse of Facebook. People go into their, they tend to read and hear and, repost things that they agree with. There's a confirmation bias very rampant there. If people are posting on your page or places you go and you don't like what they say, well, I'll just block that person. I'm not going to listen to it. And I'll go back to listening to the people who are feeding me what I want to hear. So I think social media, and particularly Facebook, is one of the big places people go. They may start being very interested in national news, and that's fine. And there are many good sources of national news, but they don't fulfill that local function of going to the city council meeting, keeping them, doing the freedom of information request so that the mayor is forced to give you the reports from the zoning board, whatever it might be. So it takes away one of the big, I mean, you use the term watchdog journalism, accountability journalism, all of those things. And some of it is really kind of nitty gritty. It's like, do you have the sources in the state social, in the local social services department? Do you have, in our time of this terrible pandemic, do you have the sources in the local hospitals, in the the county health department? And are you able to get that information out in an expert way? So that's one of the big problems.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I want to ask you to think a little bit with us about some of the solutions that have been floated by lots of folks that we've talked to in the course of this series, and sort of get your take on some of them. One in particular, one interesting piece of this debate is the question of government subsidy and a more sort of public support, public media support model. And I'd like to ask you what you about what you think about this, but I especially want to ask you what you think about this, because I think that you come at it from this sort of super interesting juxtaposition between the two sets of things that you have primarily written about in the last couple of years: the vilification of the press by Trump and his administration, the ways he's sort of seen as actively working against and even endangering the press from that governmental post. And then on the other hand, this crisis in news deserts and the loss of local news, and the ways that the sort of dwindling set of ways that might be viable for supporting that kind of news gathering. So it seems like having explored both of these really positions you to be in a super unique spot for commenting on the tensions that we might face as we consider the risks and benefits of a heavier role for government in subsidizing and sustaining news gathering and news gatherers. And so I just wonder what your take is on that tension.
Well, like most journalists, I never really liked the idea of news organizations being funded by the government, because the government is made up of people, and sometimes people don't like the reporting that you're doing. And we know, I mean, would we want, we saw a very vivid example of this with what the Trump administration did with the Voice of America and those associated agencies. He wanted his propaganda to be spread out. And so, well, let's get someone in there who's going to do my bidding, fire the journalists, put in the propagandists, and, all with the sort of threat of, here's where your funding comes from. So if we had had 4 more years of that, I don't think we'd have had, a good outcome there. It was pretty troubling as it was. So do we want to put local newspapers, for example, in the hands of local or federal sources who may well not, like, the press has an adversarial role with government. So do we really want the government dishing out the money? It's problematic. At the same time, we're in trouble. And so while there was a time when people like me, if there is such a thing, really disliked the idea of any public funding, I think that's changing somewhat, because, there would be a way to build in guardrails, I think, just as there are with, for example, public libraries or PBS or National Public Radio. And if the alternative is you're going to die, well, I guess it would be better to really work on a way to make the funding safe.
Right. And are people like you, that's who we're talking about now, warming to it because it seems increasingly like the one of the few remaining options? Or do you think that you're warming to it because the state of emergency is so great that there's not enough time for other solutions to play out? I sense a little of both from the book, right? That temporal crisis that you're pointing to, where right maybe we've kind of crossed the Rubicon, and the chance of us getting this back is dwindling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for one thing, I don't think there's anything on the table right now that says, hey, here's a few $billions and we're happy to hand this to you at any time as long as you come around to it. That it doesn't exist. So, but you're right. It is partly that there's a crisis we have a crisis on our hands and we need to look for immediate solutions. And it's partly that, you know, that we think it might be able to work without anything too terrible happening. So, and you know, there are ways to do it in a less direct way, which might be easier to sort of protect.
Yeah, that's helpful.
For example, you could make sure that federal agencies spend some portion of their advertising budget or their communications budget in local news. Okay, well, they're going to spend that money anyway. You can't have any editorial say over it. It has to be spent. I mean, that's kind of seems like it wouldn't be too objectionable.
Right, buffered from the content question.
Yes.
Okay. Scott, I'm going to hand things over to you. Thank you, Margaret.
Hi, thank you so much, Margaret, for being here. Since my wife was setting up an LLC, I noticed that the legal requirement is that you actually have to pay for notification in newspapers. So there's actually, there are these issues. Since you're in such a unique situation, having been editor of Buffalo News, I was wondering if you could just be a bit more concrete. How much money are we talking about a year that a place like Buffalo News needs? Like from, I mean, I know like what's the baseline, but what's the ballpark figure in terms of budget between what it was and let's say at the turn of the millennium and now, and how much would be needed to bring the Buffalo News back up to, let's just say, that baseline?
Well, I don't think I can really, I can give you some figures, but I can't answer the overarching question because I just don't know. But I can tell you this: when I took over as editor in 1999, and I then did the job for 12 or 13 years, we had 200 people in the newsroom. That was a good, robust newsroom. Not as big as some local newsrooms, but I can tell you that right now, a much more typical size for a local newspaper newsroom is more like 50. So we had at that time a newsroom budget of around $13 million. Now, it would cost more now because salaries would have gone up, costs would have gone up. But then again, it would cost less because there's so many fewer people there. So, but that might give you some sense of what the scale is. But one of the real problems when you deal with this is indeed scale, because you've got to fix this problem all over the country, in every city and in many small towns. I mean, small town, I don't consider the Buffalo News a small town paper. It's a metro paper. It serves 8 counties of Western New York, with Buffalo at the center of it. But in many cases, I mean, more than 2,000 newspapers have gone out of business since about 2004. I'm sure the number is higher now. And many of them are small town weeklies. Well, you might say, who cares? Small town weeklies, they don't really do serious journalism anyway. But you know what? They really serve their communities in many ways. And it's a huge loss when they go away, a huge loss. And I've heard from many people in communities where weeklies have gone under, and they're more likely to be the ones that go under, that say, we miss our paper so much. I mean, where could you get this granular information? It might not have been Pulitzer winning, but you know, it was important. Small town papers matter too.
I'm sorry, just to press on this just a bit.
Mhm.
I mean, are we talking about, so it was $13 million at the turn, at 1999. When you left, what was it, like how much did revenue fall? Did it fall by $10 million or did it fall by $2 million?
Okay, well, for one thing, I'm talking about newsroom budget. I'm not talking about the whole newspaper, which is, of course, you're running trucks and you're buying ink and you're buying newsprint and you're paying so-called hoppers, the people who get on and off the trucks. I can't actually, I don't even know those numbers anymore. I remember the newsroom numbers because that was my budget. I had to know it. But I would say that the newsroom budget, it had been cut by maybe 15 or 20%. And we had to go. So I inherited from my predecessor 200 people in the newsroom. By the time I left, we were probably down to 140. And now I'm sure it's certainly under 75. So that's a very big change in what you are able to cover.
Right. No, absolutely. I'm curious about, given how important local news is to communities, have there been attempts like there have been at the federal level with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for local subsidies, not from philanthropists, but from governments, to make up some of the difference, to subsidize local news as a way of supporting the local press?
Not that I know of, or not in any substantial way. It just, I mean, there are proposals in Congress for doing various things, but the idea that somehow, New York State government under Andrew Cuomo or Byron Brown's mayoral administration in Buffalo is going to, throw a few $100,000 at the Buffalo News, I think it would be shocking. I mean, there's no precedent for it, and I don't think that it would happen.
Do you think it would be welcome? That is, do you think communities would think that this was a good use of their tax dollars?
I don't know. I have real questions about that. I mean, I'm not even sure it would be welcomed by the companies themselves. But would regular people think it was a good use of tax dollars? I mean, some would, unfortunately, I don't know how it would break down. Some would probably think it was okay and some wouldn't. But, as you know, and a huge part of this whole discussion is there's another kind of local news that has cropped up here, which is these new digital only investigative sites or other kinds of news organizations. So, for example, in Vermont, VT Digger, in Minneapolis, MinPost, the Texas Tribune in Austin. You're seeing these in almost every substantial area. How are they funded? They're funded through grants, philanthropy, and membership. And the membership sort of bleeds into sort of events. They'll do an event, they'll do a fundraiser. There are some issues that come with that too, because if they're really doing their jobs of accountability reporting, they're probably reporting on the rich and powerful in their communities, the very same people who are the most likely to be giving them money. So it's tough.
As some newspapers migrate to the subscription paywall model, do you imagine the U.S. papers moving closer to the more European model of partisan papers, or do you think that that's so entrenched, the kind of neutrality, objectivity model that there would be strong resistance to that?
Well, one of the things that's happening in a lot of localities is there are these so-called pink slime sites that have cropped up, which are highly partisan, hyper-partisan, funded, who knows what their funding is, presenting themselves as traditional local news sites. They call themselves things like, they might call themselves the Buffalo Gazette or something like that. Sounds good, right? Sounds like a tradition, but it's not. It is in fact a hyper-partisan site with possibly with dark money funding, and it's happening more and more. And how do you, with a population that is so fractured, how do you even educate people or even get across to them the idea that that might not be so good? I think if I had that conversation with people in the Buffalo area, they might say to me, well, the Buffalo News is pretty biased too, if you ask me. You've always heard this, but this is a different standard. This is not like reporters who have been in the business for 20 years who correct their mistakes and subscribe to a code of ethics. It's, potentially sleazy people who are trying to make something happen that's not about getting the facts across.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to hand this over to Jack. Thank you, Margaret.
You're welcome.
Margaret, I wanted to shift the focus slightly to the other thing that you've been working on, which is attacks on the press, the problem of propaganda. I want to tie this to local news in the following way. By the way, when I speak of propaganda, what I mean is not simply falsity, not simply false information or disinformation, but the kind of news coverage or the kind of content which is designed to undermine the trust that's necessary for democracy to function. Basically to set people against each other, to make people doubt that anything can be true or false, to cause people to adhere merely to their tribes, and basically to undermine the kinds of norms of trust that are necessary for republics to function. So that's what I primarily mean by propaganda. Many people use it to simply refer to what's false. Now, the question I'm interested in, and it follows directly from what you said to Scott, has to do with the relationship between local news and propaganda. Now, if you had asked me before the rise of these pink slime sites, I would have said that there's a puzzling connection between local news and propaganda, in that propaganda is much more successful, or has proven itself much more successful in the United States at the national level, or aimed at broad audiences. And that local news organizations, although you have Sinclair buying up radio stations, for example, have more or less been less likely to turn into just propaganda mills. Now, I want to know, and we'll talk about pink slime in a second, but I want to know whether that intuition is correct. It might be incorrect. But second of all, is there anything economically or structurally about local news that causes this difference?
Well, I think that, the national trends tend to make their way into localities over time. One of the examples of that is, as we all know, President Trump has run around calling legitimate news organizations fake news when he doesn't like the story that they do, or he's even referred to specific people, Jim Acosta from CNN, you are fake news. Right. Well, that phrase, which really he brought to the fore, is now in many international locations. Would-be autocrats all over the world are using similar kinds of disparagement of the press. It's also made its way into localities, so that a perfectly good news report that displeases the local congressman will be called in a fundraising letter fake news. Mm-hmm. So the same trends that happen on the national front, and that have happened so disturbingly over the past 4 years, or actually longer, are happening locally. Is there, I think that there is some protection against that because of the greater trust that people seem to feel with their local news organizations. Why do they feel that trust? I think because the reporters and editors are right there in their communities. Their children may go to school with your children, you may see them in the grocery store. They're part of the community, and they're not quite so, they're not quite so otherized as the national press is from government.
Well, I wanted to separate out two different points, which might be confused. One is, I have no doubt that local politicians will adopt whatever propagandistic techniques are used by national politicians, so they'll call them fake news. That's not what I was interested in so much. I was interested in rather whether there's something in the model of local news, covering what happens at the school board, covering what happens at the state legislature, that basically creates a certain kind of journalism and it meets a certain kind of demand, which is kind of orthogonal to the business model of propagandistic mills.
Which is, I'm sorry, I missed your word, which is
Orthogonal, at cross purposes with. That is to say, I could certainly imagine a local newspaper that was a very propagandistic, but it would seem to me that it doesn't work well as a business model because it's not national. You see, whereas a local news organizations are basically, why people want them is because they cover local news, you see?
yeah, I mean, I haven't really thought through that point, but it makes sense. I think that, you know, also people are a little bit more aware. I think, you know, citizens of localities are more aware of something being wrong or propagandistic because they may have some direct knowledge of it.
Right.
They may know, oh, well, that's not true. My you know, brother is involved in that very situation and he's told me what's really happening and here's what it is. You know, there's just a little bit more involvement, so that I think there are some protections against it, and that's part of why people have a higher, you know, it's not as if it's tremendously well trusted, but it's better trusted. Local news is better trusted than national. And I think it's all part of sort of the same puzzle.
This is related to the point about the pink slime news sites that have sprung up. What I know of them, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is most of them are just online.
Yes.
They borrow a locality's name, but the coverage is mostly not local at all. And mostly it's aimed toward getting attention and clicks in social media. So they really aren't, they look like on their face that they're local news organizations. They're actually not. They're click mills. They're basically designed to gain national attention. And the vast majority of local news organizations don't do that. That's not their business model.
Right. No, that's a good description of them. They may sort of have a little bit of a facade of local news here and there. You know, maybe they'll take something and rework it so that it can have a local headline on it, or, you know, there's some sort of effort to make it look a little bit like it's legit. But you're right. They're basically coming at it from a national partisan point of view and slapping a locality's name on it to see if you can, you know, fool some of the people some of the time. And you're right, it is intended to be shared on, it's intended to be shared to a large extent on Facebook, and it is. Yeah.
So is it mainly a hijacking of the wellspring of goodwill and trust that local news has? Like, I might not know, even as a relatively well-educated, savvy consumer of the news someplace else in the country, what the local daily newspaper in, you know, Buffalo or Cleveland's name is. And so, but we think that local regional newspapers are trustworthy, and so they're taking advantage of that notion.
Absolutely. I mean, it's intended to do exactly that.
Yeah.
Because sure, it sounds like an old-timey, you know, well-respected local newspaper with all of the things that you expect to have come along with that. They're not calling themselves, you know, the Cleveland Sleazemeister or something. You know, it's got a traditional name on it for a reason, and it is a hijacking, and that's a great way to put it.
All right, well, this brings me to the next point I wanted to talk about, which is this. There's no better word for it. I'm going to use the term de-Trumpification, but here's the idea. If you think about propaganda in democratic societies, propaganda is never completely eliminated. That's why, because it's useful for politicians to engage in the kind of rhetoric that undermines news organizations, that undermines trust in facts, trust in expertise, trust in journalism. Politicians always have temptations to do it. For that reason, propaganda is an endemic feature of democracies. What we have is pandemic right now. We have a situation in which a very, very large percentage of the voting population believes false stories that have been spread by politicians, both local and national. A healthy democracy would find some way of returning our media ecology from a pandemic situation of propaganda to a merely endemic situation, low level, you know, nonsense that's always found whenever you have politicians who don't like to be criticized. Now, the question I'm interested in is what are the mechanisms by which we move from our pandemic situation to an endemic situation? And what I wanted to ask you, based upon what we were just talking about, is what role local news might play in that transformation, getting back to something that looks more normal.
Well, I think we have to be much better at teaching media and news literacy in in the classroom, and it has to come early, and it has to come. You know, you hear people talk about why isn't civics taught anymore, and there's truth to that. And I think that, you know, teaching young people to distinguish real stuff from propaganda is a part of that, but that's a long game, isn't it? You know, that's like you're dealing with a 10-year-old, and by the time, you know, we need to fix this problem more quickly. So I think we have to do that. And, you know, I think that we are not good in the reality-based press at sort of telling our story. It's funny because we're in the communication business, and we're in the business of communicating facts and getting information across, but we're not very good at telling our own story. And I think we need, whether it's through a national advertising campaign or these organizations getting together and getting the word out in some other way, we need to communicate our worth, and quickly and effectively.
Right.
You know, I worry though, because I feel like so much of the country is so resistant to that, and so, in a way, so lost to it. It's pretty distressing.
Well, I want to offer a little bit of hope, not to say solutions, but the United States is not the first country that has transitioned from demagogic politics into a more or less normal politics. So to take an extreme example, Germany, after the war, had this problem in a very extreme way. They had a population that believed all sorts of nonsense, and they had to transition to a democratic multi-party democracy. And when I talk to folks in Europe, I always ask, well, how did you do it? I mean, because eventually it succeeded. And the story they told me is very similar to the story you just told me. It has to do with the educational system. There has to be investment in an educational system so that the next generation of folks basically trusts sources of information and expertise. But then the question is, what are you going to do about adults, as you said, right? These are people who are, right, they're not going to be in an educational system. And for that, you need other forms of social influence, which is tied to what you just said. That you said, in other words, that social influence campaigns, perhaps using the new media, the media that have been part of the problem, have to be a necessary feature of how we move away from a propaganda-based media ecology to one that's more normal.
Right. And I mean, we've seen, you know, two of the biggest and most influential news companies, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and actually CNN has done this too, start these big ad campaigns, or sort of, in the case of the Post, you know, the motto, democracy dies in darkness. Well, you know, there was sort of mocked, and it's so goth sounding, it's kind of silly. But now, if I say to somebody, the Washington Post, they're going to probably say back to me, democracy dies in darkness. I mean, they got it, you know, whether they think it's kind of silly or not. The New York Times did the Truth Matters, a whole big campaign. You'd see it on billboards and on TV and in social media. And CNN did something similar, but we don't see it in local probably because they don't have the money. But might they have the money if they all got together? Yes, I think they would. And perhaps we should hold Facebook and Google's feet to the fire and have them pay for it, since they've done so much to siphon off the ad revenue from these local organizations. Maybe they'd like to try to save it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Margaret. Back to you, Sandy.
I would suggest that reviving local news and local journalism is what we all of us hope is part of the answer as well. And today's headline in the Wall Street Journal that Alden is now bidding more stridently to obtain Tribune is not going in the right direction, at least not based on Alden's past history of minimizing local journalism.
No, Alden is the worst possible. I mean, I think it's sort of generally accepted that Alden is the worst possible owner that can come your way. And Tribune, of course, has been such a, it's a has a great history, the Chicago Tribune, but also the other papers that it has owned, the Baltimore Sun and others. These have been great newspapers, many of them with foreign bureaus and multiple Pulitzers and great columnists and important watchdog work. And to see them controlled by Alden, which is so profit oriented and really strip mining the last of the profits from these companies, not with an eye to sustaining them into the future, but with an eye to next quarter or next year's profit and loss statement is really distressing. But that's a huge trend that's been happening in papers that used to be owned by local people, or perhaps by a small corporation, or by a good chain, the Knight Ridder chain, McClatchy chain, pretty good owners. Now they've been gobbled up by basically by hedge funds. So it's another part of the situation that's, and how do you reverse that? I really don't know. My owner in Buffalo for a long time was Warren Buffett, the Berkshire Hathaway. And, just a couple of years ago, not long ago at all, he sold all of his papers to a chain, Lee Enterprises. And he did it soon after saying, or at the time saying, that newspapers were once great businesses. They were once a monopoly, and then they were a franchise, and then they were competitive, and now they're toast. His words. So that's pretty tough to hear from the person who owned the place, where I have such a strong emotional connection.
Yeah, I remember that. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for this conversation, Margaret. We really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It's great to hear your thoughts as well.